For 6 straight years, my father banned me from our family Christmas because I married a farmer. My mother claimed my husband smelled like cattle and ruined their high society aesthetic. Then they went completely bankrupt. After 6 years of silence, my phone rang. My father demanded $5 million to save his real estate empire. I did not yell, I did not argue. I simply asked one question that made them hang up immediately. But I had no idea their desperate call was only the beginning of a nightmare. My name is Abigail, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to family who underestimated your worth. I sat at the head of a long mahogany table inside the sleek glass-walled boardroom of Verdant Solutions. It was a normal Tuesday morning, and sunlight streamed through the windows of our corporate headquarters. My husband Caleb and I had co-founded this sustainable agricultural technology firm right out of our tiny starter home. Now it was a multi-million-dollar enterprise supplying national grocery chains across the country. I wore a tailored navy suit, looking over quarterly expansion reports while my executive team discussed our latest acquisition. My life was peaceful, structured, and entirely my own. The toxic chaos of my childhood felt like a distant memory. I spent my youth trying to earn a single word of praise from my parents, Harrison and Vivian. They were wealthy socialites who cared more about country club memberships and appearances than their own daughter. When I married Caleb, they cut me out of their lives completely. They called him a dirt kicker and treated my agricultural degree like a disease. I had not heard a word from them in 6 long years. No birthday cards came in the mail. No holiday greetings arrived. I was a ghost to them. My executive vice president was explaining our new distribution logistics when my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the polished wood table. I glanced down at the screen, intending to send the call straight to voicemail. The name flashing across the digital display made my blood run completely cold. It read, Harrison's cell. My breath hitched in my throat. My father was calling me. For a moment, I just stared at the glowing screen, unable to process what was happening. 1,000 different scenarios rushed through my mind. Was someone hurt? Had there been a terrible accident? Was my mother in the hospital? The 6 years of bitter silence made this sudden intrusion feel incredibly alarming. I held up my hand to pause the presentation. I apologized to my team and stepped out of the glass boardroom and into the quiet, empty hallway of our executive suite. My hands were shaking as I pressed the green button to accept the call. I braced myself for terrible news. I held the phone to my ear and said a cautious hello. There were no pleasantries. There was no awkward small talk or inquiries about my health. My father did not ask how I had been doing for the last half-decade. Harrison spoke with a frantic, demanding tone that immediately put me on edge. He sounded out of breath and desperate. Abigail, I need you to wire $5 million to a holding account by this Friday morning. He barked the order as if I were still a disobedient teenager living under his roof. I need the routing number set up today, and you cannot mention this to anyone. I stood frozen in the hallway, gripping my phone. $5 million. The audacity of the demand was staggering. I had not spoken to this man since he locked me out of his house in a blizzard, and now his first words to me were a demand for millions. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could form a sentence, another voice chimed in loudly on speakerphone. It was my mother, Vivian. Her voice was sharp and laced with the same manipulative guilt she had weaponized throughout my entire childhood. You owe us for raising you, Abigail, she snapped through the speaker. Do your duty to this family for once in your life. Your brother-in-law Spencer is facing a slight liquidity crisis with his real estate firm. The banks are being entirely unreasonable, and we need this cash injection immediately to protect our assets. I closed my eyes and let out a slow, steady breath. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. This was not a medical emergency. This was not a change of heart or a desire to reconnect. My golden child sister Brittany had married Spencer 8 years ago. Spencer was a smooth-talking commercial real estate developer whom my parents absolutely adored. They considered him a real businessman, unlike my farmer husband. Now Spencer was apparently bankrupting them all, and they expected me to drain my company to bail him out. The disrespect was truly impressive. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not revert to the anxious, eager to please daughter they remembered. I stood tall in the hallway of the empire I had built and spoke with a cold corporate tone. Are you asking the daughter you banned from Christmas or the CEO of the holding firm that just bought your defaulted debt? The line went dead silent. I could hear my father take a ragged breath. He stammered, trying to form a word, but nothing came out. The realization of what I had just said crashed down on him. I simply pressed the red button and hung up the phone. I smiled and turned around, assuming the skirmish was over. I walked toward the glass boardroom, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. I was finally free. But as I reached for the door, my phone buzzed violently in my hand. A loud alarm began blaring from my estate security application. I opened the live camera video feed and my heart instantly stopped. The high-definition video showed my private driveway. Harrison, Vivian, and my golden child sister Brittany were standing right there. They were violently pounding on the secure keypad outside our main gates. Their faces were twisted in pure rage as they screamed into the intercom system. They did not just make a phone call from the city. They were already here at my home, demanding to be let inside. The nightmare was far from over. For 6 straight years, my father banned me from our family Christmas because I married a farmer. My mother claimed my husband smelled like cattle and ruined their high society aesthetic. Then they went completely bankrupt. After 6 years of silence, my phone rang. My father demanded $5 million to save his real estate empire. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply asked one question that made them hang up immediately. But I had no idea their desperate call was only the beginning of a nightmare. My name is Abigail, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to family who underestimated your worth. I sat at the head of a long mahogany table inside the sleek glass-walled boardroom of Verdant Solutions. It was a normal Tuesday morning, and sunlight streamed through the windows of our corporate headquarters. My husband Caleb and I had co-founded this sustainable agricultural technology firm right out of our tiny starter home. Now it was a multi-million-dollar enterprise supplying national grocery chains across the country. I wore a tailored navy suit, looking over quarterly expansion reports while my executive team discussed our latest acquisition. My life was peaceful, structured, and entirely my own. The toxic chaos of my childhood felt like a distant memory. I spent my youth trying to earn a single word of praise from my parents, Harrison and Vivian. They were wealthy socialites who cared more about country club memberships and appearances than their own daughter. When I married Caleb, they cut me out of their lives completely. They called him a dirt kicker and treated my agricultural degree like a disease. I had not heard a word from them in 6 long years. No birthday cards came in the mail, no holiday greetings arrived. I was a ghost to them. My executive vice president was explaining our new distribution logistics when my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the polished wood table. I glanced down at the screen, intending to send the call straight to voicemail. The name flashing across the digital display made my blood run completely cold. It read, Harrison Cell. My breath hitched in my throat. My father was calling me. For a moment, I just stared at the glowing screen, unable to process what was happening. 1,000 different scenarios rushed through my mind. Was someone hurt? Had there been a terrible accident? Was my mother in the hospital? The 6 years of bitter silence made this sudden intrusion feel incredibly alarming. I held up my hand to pause the presentation. I apologized to my team and stepped out of the glass boardroom and into the quiet, empty hallway of our executive suite. My hands were shaking as I pressed the green button to accept the call. I braced myself for terrible news. I held the phone to my ear and said a cautious hello. There were no polite pleasantries exchanged. There was no awkward small talk about the weather or how my life had been going during our long estrangement. Harrison spoke with a frantic, demanding tone that immediately put me on edge. He sounded out of breath and desperate. Abigail, I need you to wire $5 million to a holding account by this Friday morning. He barked the order as if I were still a pathetic, disobedient teenager living under his roof. I need the routing number set up today, and you cannot mention this to anyone. I stood completely frozen in the quiet hallway, gripping my cell phone with white knuckles. $5 million whole dollars. The absolute audacity of the massive financial demand was staggering to me. I had not spoken to this man since he locked me out in a blizzard, and now his first words to me were a demand for millions. I opened my mouth to respond, but another voice chimed in loudly on speakerphone. It was my mother, Vivian. Her voice was sharp and laced with the same manipulative guilt she had weaponized throughout my entire childhood. "You owe us for raising you, Abigail," she snapped through the speaker. "Do your duty to this family for once in your life. Your brother-in-law Spencer is facing a slight liquidity crisis with his real estate firm. The banks are being entirely unreasonable, and we need this cash injection immediately to protect our assets." I closed my eyes and let out a slow, steady breath. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. This was not a medical emergency. This was not a change of heart or a desire to reconnect. My golden child sister Brittany had married Spencer 8 years ago. Spencer was a smooth-talking commercial real estate developer whom my parents absolutely adored. They considered him a real businessman, unlike my farmer husband. Now Spencer was apparently bankrupting them all, and they expected me to drain my company to bail him out. The disrespect was truly impressive. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not revert to the anxious, eager-to-please daughter they remembered. I stood tall in the hallway of the empire I had built and spoke with a cold corporate tone. "Are you asking the daughter you banned from Christmas, or the CEO of the holding firm that just bought your defaulted debt?" The line went dead silent. I could hear my father take a ragged breath. He stammered, trying to form a word, but nothing came out. The realization of what I had just said crashed down on him. I simply pressed the red button and hung up the phone. I smiled and turned around, assuming the skirmish was over. I walked toward the glass boardroom, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. I was finally free. But as I reached for the door, my phone buzzed violently in my hand. A loud alarm began blaring from my estate security application. I opened the live camera video feed and my heart instantly stopped. The high-definition video showed my private driveway. Harrison, Vivian, and my golden child sister Brittany were standing right there. They were violently pounding on the secure keypad outside our main gates. Their faces were twisted in pure rage as they screamed into the intercom system. They did not just make a phone call from the city. They were already here at my home, demanding to be let inside. The nightmare was far from over. Brittany tapped the screen of her phone with a manicured fingernail. A smug, victorious smile spread across her face as she lifted the device to her ear. I watched in absolute disbelief as she actually dialed 911. She was not just making an empty threat to extort money. She was escalating a pathetic family tantrum into a severe legal crisis. Within seconds, her entire demeanor shifted. The aggressive, blackmailing extortionist vanished. In her place stood a terrified, fragile victim. Her voice trembled perfectly as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher, claiming that her sister's hulking husband was threatening them with physical violence at the gate. Caleb did not flinch. He stood firmly beside me, his broad shoulders relaxed, his expression an impenetrable mask of calm. He simply crossed his arms over his chest and waited. My father puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of Brittany's performance. My mother pulled her designer coat tighter around her thin frame, shooting me a look of pure venom. They truly believed they had cornered me. They thought I would panic, pull out my checkbook, and beg them to call off the police to protect my company's public image. They were relying on the old version of me, the girl who would do absolutely anything to keep the peace and avoid a public scandal. But that girl died in the freezing snow 6 years ago. Red and blue lights cut through the morning fog just 10 minutes later. 2 local police cruisers pulled up to our private security gate, tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. 4 officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Brittany immediately burst into hysterical tears. She rushed toward the nearest officer, pointing a trembling finger at Caleb. She sobbed out a fabricated story about how we had lured them out here, how Caleb had lunged at her father, and how she feared for her life. Harrison and Vivian backed up her performance perfectly, playing the roles of terrified, concerned parents who were only trying to check on their estranged daughter. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, held up his hand to quiet them. He instructed his partner to keep my family by their luxury SUV while he approached the gate to speak with Caleb and me. The officer looked between the heavy iron bars, his gaze lingering on Caleb's solid frame, before turning to me. He asked for our side of the story, his tone professional, but carrying an edge of suspicion planted by my sister's tears. I did not raise my voice. I did not match Brittany's frantic energy. I looked the officer dead in the eye and explained that these people were my estranged family and they were attempting to extort $5 million from me. I told him I needed to establish a documented pattern of their deeply erratic and hostile behavior. I took a steady breath and recounted the events of Christmas Eve 6 years ago. It was not a sad story meant to garner pity. It was a cold recitation of facts to prove their malicious nature. I told the officer about driving through a blinding blizzard just to bring them gifts. I detailed how my father opened his heavy oak door, took one look at Caleb's snow-covered work boots, and declared that my husband smelled like livestock. He said we would ruin his imported Italian marble floors. When I refused to leave Caleb in the car and come inside alone, my father physically shoved me backward into the freezing snow. I heard the deadbolt click into place. A moment later, my winter coat was thrown out the second-story window into a snowbank. We were stranded in sub-zero temperatures on their front porch. Caleb had to wrap me in his own jacket and carry me to his truck so I would not freeze. I explained to the officer that the people crying by that SUV were the same people who happily left me to die in a winter storm because my husband was a farmer. Now that they were facing bankruptcy, they felt entitled to terrorize us at our own home. The officer listened quietly, his rigid posture softening slightly, but he needed more than just my harrowing backstory. Brittany was still weeping loudly to the other officers, waving her phone and claiming she had an audio recording of Caleb making threats. The situation was teetering on a dangerous edge. That was when Caleb casually reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times and accessed our estate security system. "We do not just have cameras," Caleb told the officer in his deep, steady voice. "We have high-definition audio and visual recording at every access point on this property." Caleb handed the phone through the bars of the gate. The officer pressed play. The crisp, undeniable audio filled the quiet morning air. Every single word of Brittany's malicious blackmail attempt played back with crystal clarity. The officers heard her explicitly threaten to edit an audio clip. They heard her demand a blank check. They heard my mother sneering insults about Caleb smelling like cattle. They heard my father screaming like an unhinged lunatic. The contrast between Brittany's fabricated victim routine and the undeniable reality of the security footage was absolute and immediate. The lead officer's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. He handed the phone back to Caleb with a curt nod of thanks. He turned around and marched directly back to the luxury SUV. The mood shifted so violently that my mother actually took a step backward in fear. The officer did not mince words. He informed Brittany that she had just committed a serious crime by weaponizing the emergency dispatch system and filing a false police report. He unclipped his handcuffs and told her she was seconds away from being arrested and placed in the back of his cruiser. Brittany's fake tears dried up instantly, her face drained of all color. Harrison and Vivian frantically tried to play the victims from a different angle, claiming they were just concerned parents who let their emotions take over. They begged the officers not to arrest their daughter. The police were entirely unimpressed. The lead officer ordered them to leave the property immediately under the threat of being arrested for criminal trespassing. They scrambled into their vehicle and sped away. As the SUV sped away, a police officer handed me a crumpled document. It had dropped from Brittany's purse during the commotion. It was a bank foreclosure notice on Harrison's estate. My own signature was sitting at the bottom as the financial guarantor. I stared down at the blue ink on the crumpled paper, my mind refusing to process the loops and slants that formed my name. The signature was a near-perfect replica of my own, sitting directly beneath a terrifying sum of money. Caleb placed a heavy, grounding hand on my shoulder. I handed him the paper without saying a single word. His eyes scanned the document, his jaw tightening as he read the dense legal jargon. We walked straight to Caleb's truck, got in, and drove directly toward the city. The silence in the cab was thick heavy, with the realization that my family had not just come to our gate to throw a tantrum. They were running from a financial avalanche they had secretly tied us to. We pulled up to a towering glass and steel building in the heart of the financial district. We took the private elevator to the top floor, stepping into the sleek, quiet reception area of my corporate attorney. Gregory was a man who did not waste words. He had been instrumental in helping me build the legal fortress around our business. He was ruthless, precise, and ferociously protective of our assets. We bypassed his secretary and walked straight into his corner office. Gregory looked up from his dual monitors, noting our grim expressions instantly. He stood up, gestured to the heavy leather chairs across from his desk, and asked what was wrong. I slid the crumpled foreclosure notice across the smooth glass surface of his desk. To understand the gravity of the paper sitting between us, you must first understand exactly what Caleb and I had built. When my parents cut me off, they assumed I would fail. They thought Caleb was just a simple man playing in the dirt. But Caleb possessed generational farming knowledge, and I held a top-tier business degree. Together, we did not just plant vegetables or run a quaint local farm stand. I utilized my education to scale his massive acreage into a dominant, highly optimized supply chain. We created Verdant Solutions, an agricultural technology empire that currently supplied fresh, sustainable produce to 3 of the largest national grocery conglomerates in the country. Our revenue was staggering, our operations were flawless, and our corporate structure was designed to be completely untouchable. Or so I thought. Gregory picked up the document, adjusting his reading glasses. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of his office felt deafening as he read through the dense legal text. His usually stoic expression shifted into a deep frown. He read it a second time, tracing lines of text with the tip of his silver pen. He finally looked up, his eyes grave and entirely serious. Abigail, he started, his voice completely stripped of its usual brisk confidence. This is not just a standard foreclosure notice. This is a claim against a massive commercial loan, and your holding company is listed as the primary financial guarantor. I shook my head, insisting that was impossible. I told him I had never signed anything remotely related to my father or Spencer. I explained that I had not spoken to them in 6 years, let alone authorized a corporate guarantee for their failing real estate ventures. Gregory turned his computer monitor toward us and quickly pulled up our corporate filings, cross-referencing the account numbers listed on the crumpled notice. He typed rapidly, navigating through secure banking portals until he found the hidden connection. When you were 18, he explained slowly, your father set up a standard dormant trust fund in your name. It was an old account, completely inactive, and something you never actually controlled or accessed. Spencer somehow managed to dig up the original paperwork for that dormant trust. He used the archaic legal structure of that forgotten account to forge a bridge directly to your current corporate assets. Spencer essentially impersonated you on paper. He tied the multi-million-dollar valuation of Verdant Solutions to his own commercial real estate firm, using your company's immense value as collateral to secure a desperate high-risk loan from the bank. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Spencer had bypassed every modern security measure we had by exploiting a forgotten ghost of my childhood. But a loan of that magnitude, tying 2 separate corporate entities together, required strict legal verification. It required a witness. It required an official notary to verify that I was physically present and signing those papers of my own free will. I asked Gregory how any bank could accept the forgery without verifying my identity. Gregory looked back down at the document. He flipped to the second page, pointing to the bottom right corner. There, stamped in bold black ink, was an official state notary seal. Caleb leaned in closer, reading the name stamped inside the official circle. Vivian Thorne, my mother. She was a licensed real estate notary. She had used her official state credentials to legally notarize the forged signature herself. The rot in my family ran far deeper than petty insults or snobbery. My own mother had actively participated in a massive federal fraud. She had sat in a room with Spencer, watched him forge my name, and stamped it with her official seal, perfectly willing to sacrifice my entire livelihood to save her golden child's husband from his own catastrophic failures. I felt a cold nausea settle in my stomach. The puzzle pieces clicked together. Their sudden phone call demanding $5 million. Their frantic, aggressive appearance at my gate. They knew the bank had finally called in the defaulted loan, and they were trying to bully me into paying it off quietly before I discovered the forgery. They thought they could terrorize me into compliance. Gregory folded his hands on the desk, looking at me with absolute seriousness. He laid out the trap that had just snapped shut around my ankles. He explained that we had two choices, and both were catastrophic. If I walked straight to the police right now and reported the forgery, I would save my company, but the resulting federal investigation would send my mother directly to a federal penitentiary for notary fraud and conspiracy. But if I ignored it to protect her from prison, the bank would legally seize millions of dollars in capital from Verdant Solutions to pay off Spencer's outstanding debts. This would cripple the empire Caleb and I had poured our blood and sweat into building from the ground up. I was forced into a dark, suffocating corner with absolutely no safe way out. I stared at the foreclosure document lying on the glass desk. Gregory was entirely right. If I called the authorities right now, my mother would be wearing a federal prison uniform by the end of the month. I despised Vivian for what she had done, but I was not ready to detonate that specific bomb just yet. The immediate threat was the financial hemorrhage draining Verdant Solutions. We needed to stop Spencer from accessing the capital he had illegally tied to my name. Gregory warned me that filing a formal legal injunction could take up to 48 hours depending on the court docket. Spencer could easily wire the remaining funds to an untraceable offshore holding account long before any judge signed the protective order. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and smoothed the front of my navy suit. I told Gregory to draft the injunction anyway, but I was going to handle the immediate threat in person. Caleb placed a supportive hand on the small of my back as we walked out of the corporate office and got back into his truck. We drove straight toward the financial district. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a cold and gray city skyline. My mind shifted from the emotional shock of my family betraying me into a pure corporate strategy mindset. I was no longer the discarded daughter crying in the snow. I was a chief executive officer protecting her assets. The target was the main regional branch of Continental Trust. It was the exact financial institution Spencer used to launder his failing real estate developments. Caleb parked the truck across the street from the imposing marble building. We walked through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped into the cavernous, hushed lobby. The air smelled of expensive leather and polished brass. The quiet murmur of banking transactions echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I scanned the vast room and spotted them almost immediately. My father and Spencer were standing near the high-wealth client service desks. They did not look like the confident, untouchable men of high society they pretended to be. They looked frantic. Harrison was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. His usually impeccable posture was slumped. Spencer was leaning heavily over the marble counter, aggressively tapping his gold pen against the glass partition. He was loudly demanding that the bank teller expedite a massive wire transfer. He wanted the remaining lines of credit liquidated immediately. Caleb and I approached them with slow, deliberate steps. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished stone floor, drawing their attention. Spencer turned his head, and his eyes widened in momentary shock when he saw me standing there. The color completely drained from my father's face. He took a nervous step backward, bumping into a velvet stanchion. Spencer quickly recovered his composure, masking his absolute panic with a thick layer of arrogant hostility. He abandoned the teller and marched directly toward us, blocking my path to the administrative offices. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. Spencer looked me up and down with a sneer before shifting his derisive gaze to Caleb. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet lobby. "Look who decided to leave the petting zoo," he mocked, stepping uncomfortably close to Caleb. "Did you wipe the manure off your boots before walking onto these nice, clean floors?" Caleb did not react to the insult. He simply stared down at Spencer with the calm, terrifying patience of a man who routinely wrangles thousand-pound animals. I stepped smoothly between them, keeping my voice hushed but razor-sharp. I told Spencer The wire transfer he was attempting to process was tied to a fraudulent corporate guarantee. I advised him to step away from the counter before he made his situation significantly worse. Spencer leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His eyes were wide and manic. He lowered his voice to a vicious whisper, insisting that a real businessman like him would always win in a corporate setting. "You think you can play in the big leagues, Abigail?" he sneered, his face twisted in ugly arrogance. "You are nothing but a glorified dirt farmer just like your husband. I structured this loan perfectly. You are legally bound to my firm, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." He smiled a desperate, terrifying smile and bragged that the remaining $2 million would be wired out of the country in less than 5 minutes. He leaned closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Your fancy lawyer cannot file an injunction fast enough to stop this transaction, Abigail. By the time a judge even looks at your paperwork, the accounts will be completely drained, and your little farm stand will be holding the bag." I remained completely stoic. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply stood there and let Spencer dig his own grave with his overwhelming arrogance. He was so busy trying to feel powerful that he failed to notice the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite swinging open. The regional bank manager emerged from the back office. Mr. Sterling was an older, distinguished gentleman with silver hair and an impeccable tailored suit. He carried a leather-bound portfolio under his left arm. Spencer instantly abandoned his attempt to intimidate me the moment he spotted the senior executive approaching. His entire demeanor switched from vicious bully to eager sycophant. Spencer pasted on a bright, charming smile and stepped forward, stretching his hand out eagerly to intercept the manager. He loudly declared that it was wonderful to see Mr. Sterling and aggressively requested a moment to push his urgent wire transfer through the final approval channels. He assumed his social status would guarantee immediate service. The tension in the quiet marble lobby reached a suffocating peak. Mr. Sterling did not even break his stride. He walked right past Spencer, leaving the arrogant man standing there with his hand hanging empty in the cold air. The manager did not spare a single glance for my father either. Instead, Mr. Sterling stopped directly in front of me. He clutched his leather portfolio tightly, bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect, and spoke with absolute clarity. "Good morning to you, Abigail," he said very warmly. "It is a tremendous honor to welcome you as the newest majority shareholder of this regional bank branch." The absolute silence that fell over the bank lobby was suffocating. Spencer stood frozen with his hands suspended in the air. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, leaving a hollow mask of pure panic. My father looked as though the polished marble floor had suddenly vanished beneath his shoes. Mr. Sterling calmly explained to Spencer that as the new majority shareholder, I had exercised my executive right to freeze all outgoing commercial wire transfers pending an internal audit. The $2 million Spencer was trying to steal was locked in a digital vault. I did not gloat. I simply thanked Mr. Sterling, took Caleb by the arm, and walked out the heavy glass doors into the crisp air. We stopped the immediate hemorrhage, but I knew my family would never surrender that easily. The next morning, I was sitting in a corner booth at an upscale coffee shop near our corporate headquarters. Caleb was across town, and I was using the rare moment of solitude to review our quarterly expansion metrics. The cafe smelled of roasted espresso beans and fresh pastries. Soft jazz played over the hidden speakers, masking the low hum of conversations around me. I had just taken a sip of my dark roast when the bell above the door chimed. I did not need to look up to know who had just walked in. The frantic clicking of designer heels gave her away instantly. Brittany slid into the leather booth across from me uninvited. The aggressive extortionist who had threatened my husband and called the police to our estate was gone. In her place sat a perfectly manicured portrait of a tragic victim. Her blonde hair was messy by design, and her eyes were rimmed with red. She buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, dramatic sob that caused several patrons to turn their heads. She reached across the table, attempting to grab my hand, but I pulled my coffee cup back, leaving her grasping empty space. "Abigail, please, you have to help me," she cried, her voice trembling with manufactured despair. "Spencer is a monster. He forced me into all of this. He told me if I did not go along with his plans, we would lose everything. She pulled a tissue from her leather coat and dabbed carefully at the corners of her eyes, making sure not to smudge her mascara. She claimed she had no idea about the depth of the fraud or the forged documents. She spun a tragic tale about how Spencer was emotionally abusing her behind closed doors. She wept openly, begging for a tiny loan just to keep her two children enrolled in their private academy. She insisted that if I could just release the frozen bank funds, she could pay the tuition and finally escape her marriage. I sat back and watched her performance with silent clinical detachment. 10 years ago, her tears would have destroyed me. I would have drained my savings to save my big sister. As I watched her cry, my gaze drifted down to the designer purse resting open on her lap. She had positioned the bag at a deliberate angle facing directly toward me. Tucked deep inside the dark lining, I saw the faint pulse of a tiny red light. The realization hit me with cold, absolute clarity. Brittany was not having a breakdown. She was wearing a wire. She tracked me down to this coffee shop to bait me into a recorded confession. She needed me to verbally acknowledge the fraudulent loan as a legitimate family debt to validate Spencer's desperate narrative and save him from federal prison. It was a pathetic trap, but it was also a magnificent opportunity. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and let my expression soften into a mask of deep sisterly concern. I lowered my voice, ensuring I spoke clearly enough for the hidden microphone to pick up every single syllable. Brittany, I am incredibly sorry that you are going through such a terrible ordeal, I said, matching her tone perfectly. I completely understand that the financial documents your husband submitted to the bank have created a very complicated situation for everyone involved. I intentionally used the word submitted instead of forged. I fed her what she wanted to hear wrapped in legally ambiguous corporate speak. It sounds like the financial obligations Spencer tied to my holding company are causing a massive strain on your family. Her eyes widened with eager anticipation. She thought I was falling right into her trap. She leaned closer, her voice dripping with desperate encouragement. Yes, Abigail, it is a total nightmare. If you would just admit that the loan Spencer set up was a mutual family arrangement, we can clear up this whole bank freeze. Just say that you knew about the funds he transferred. I shook my head slowly, maintaining my sympathetic facade. I cannot release those funds, Brittany, not until I fully understand the exact timeline. I need to know exactly when the money was moved. Did you authorize the transfer, or was it solely Spencer handling the corporate accounts? Brittany was so desperate for her confession that she completely forgot her own tragic narrative. She waved her hand dismissively, abandoning the weeping victim routine for a fraction of a second. Of course I did not authorize it. She snapped, her voice laced with sudden irritation. Spencer initiated the wire fraud all by himself last Tuesday before I even knew the bank was calling in the debt. He submitted all the paperwork without my permission. I took a slow sip of my coffee. She had just explicitly admitted on a hidden recording device that her husband had committed federal wire fraud. She had completely exonerated me while simultaneously placing the entire legal burden directly onto Spencer's shoulders. The trap had snapped shut, but she was the one caught inside. Assuming she had captured enough sympathy to twist into a confession, Brittany dropped the fragile victim act. She sat up, wiped the fake tears from her face, and reached into her designer purse. Her finger brushed the hidden device and the tiny red light went dark. A smug, victorious smile spread across her face. She picked up her sunglasses and slid them on, looking at me with absolute contempt. She slid out of the booth and adjusted the collar of her coat. Do me a favor and try to dress less like a peasant for our parents' upcoming charity gala this weekend, she sneered before turning on her heel and strutting out of the coffee shop. I watched the heavy glass door of the coffee shop swing shut behind her, taking a slow, deeply calming breath. The small recorder hidden carefully inside the inner lining of my own jacket was still running, capturing the fading sound of her aggressive footsteps. I reached into my pocket and hit the stop button, locking the audio file that now completely decimated their entire extortion plot. I took one last sip of my coffee, paid my tab, and went back to work. I knew my sister would run straight back to Spencer, convinced she had won our little psychological war and secured their salvation. But the brief period of silence that followed was unnervingly short. It was a Thursday evening, exactly 2 days after the coffee shop encounter, when my personal cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. Caleb was standing by the stove, calmly chopping vegetables for dinner. I glanced down at the glowing screen and saw my mother's name flashing. I accepted the call, fully expecting another round of vicious threats or desperate demands. Instead, I heard a frail, trembling voice that sounded like it belonged to a dying woman. Vivian gasped out my name, claiming she was experiencing severe, crushing chest pains. She sobbed weakly into the receiver, saying the mounting stress of the last few days was causing her heart to fail. She begged me for a quick, temporary truce. She pleaded for a neutral family dinner to make peace before her health completely collapsed. She named an exclusive high-end restaurant downtown, insisting she just wanted to see her daughters together one last time in case the doctors gave her terrible news. I knew immediately that every single word out of her mouth was a calculated lie. My mother was a master manipulator, and a sudden medical emergency was just a new angle to force my compliance. But Caleb and I agreed that we needed to look them in the eye and see exactly what their next move would be. We needed to know how far they were willing to go to steal our livelihood. We arrived at the restaurant an hour later. The establishment was a beacon of pretentious old-world luxury nestled in a historic stone building with valet parking and doormen wearing pressed dark suits. Crystal chandeliers cast a dim amber glow over the velvet booths and polished silver cutlery. The hostess checked her leather-bound reservation book and led Caleb and me through the main dining area toward the back of the establishment. We were guided into an exclusive private dining room with heavy mahogany walls and thick soundproof drapery. Harrison, Vivian, and Brittany were already seated at a long candle-lit table. My mother, the woman who had just claimed to be suffering from a massive cardiac event, looked absolutely radiant. She was wearing a flawless crimson silk dress, her makeup perfectly applied, and she was casually swirling a glass of expensive red wine. There was no medical monitor, no sign of distress, and absolutely no trace of the fragile woman from the phone call. She did not even try to maintain the charade for a single second. She simply offered a tight, artificial smile and gestured for us to sit down. Caleb pulled out my chair, his gaze sweeping the perimeter of the room, silently assessing the environment. He sat beside me, his large hands resting calmly on the polished table. There was no polite small talk. There were no menus brought to the table or inquiries about the daily specials. The moment Caleb and I were seated, the artificial pleasantries vanished completely. Harrison reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the center of the table with a heavy, deliberate thud. He slid the contract directly across the smooth wood until it rested inches from my hands. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with cold, commanding eyes. He stated that we were going to bypass the lawyers and handle this severe financial issue as a family. He explained that Spencer's commercial real estate firm was hemorrhaging capital and the bank was threatening to liquidate everything they owned. The document sitting in front of me was a legally binding corporate restructuring agreement. Harrison demanded that I formally sign over 30% of Verdant Solutions' gross annual revenue to his holding company. He called it a necessary family tax, a small price to pay to keep his legacy out of bankruptcy. He genuinely believed he could guilt me into surrendering a third of my massive empire. Vivian chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. She reminded me about the ultimate importance of family loyalty and tradition, insisting that I owed them for the comfortable life they had provided me before I threw it all away to marry a farmer. I looked down at the contract, feeling a profound sense of disgust. They were not asking for help or a temporary bridge loan. They were demanding a permanent ransom. They expected me to bleed my own successful company dry to subsidize their profound incompetence. I did not touch the paper. I looked up, meeting my father's arrogant stare with absolute unwavering calm. I told him very clearly that I would not sign his ridiculous contract. I informed him that my company was not a piggy bank for his failures, and I would not sacrifice a single penny of the business Caleb and I had built to save Spencer from his own fraudulent decisions. Harrison did not scream or explode in rage like I expected. Instead, a slow, deeply unsettling smirk spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair, looking immensely satisfied with my defiant response. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers, signaling the waitstaff standing near the entrance of the room. The restaurant manager stepped forward from the shadows. He did not come to take our drink order. The manager reached for the heavy mahogany doors of our private dining room and pulled them shut with a solid, echoing thud. I heard the unmistakable heavy click of a deadbolt sliding into place. The realization crashed over me in a suffocating wave. This restaurant was not a neutral location chosen for a family truce. It was one of the many commercial properties owned by Spencer's tangled web of corporate shell companies. We were completely locked inside, trapped in a soundproof room with a hostile family that had just proven they would do absolutely anything to take what was mine. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoed in the sudden silence. Harrison leaned back, profound satisfaction settling over his features. He believed cornering me in a soundproof room would somehow break my resolve. Brittany sat beside him, mirroring his arrogant smirk, while my mother simply took another slow sip of her red wine. Then a side door swung open. Spencer walked into the room. He must have been waiting in there the entire time listening to the exchange. His face was flushed red with a mixture of anger and desperation. He marched directly toward our side of the table, his eyes locked on my husband. Spencer clearly calculated that I was a lost cause and decided that intimidating Caleb was his only remaining option. He stopped inches away from Caleb, breathing heavily. He grabbed the gold fountain pen that Harrison had placed next to the contract and slammed it down onto the table right in front of Caleb. Spencer demanded that Caleb act like a real man and force his wife to sign the document. He taunted Caleb, mocking his flannel shirt and calloused hands, insisting that a dirt farmer had no business interfering in corporate finance. Caleb did not even blink. He remained seated, his posture completely relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany table. This lack of reaction only infuriated Spencer further. He stepped closer, invading Caleb's personal space, and aggressively shoved the heavy gold pen directly into the center of Caleb's chest. Spencer ordered him to pick up the pen and make me sign the restructuring agreement before they decided to ruin us both. What happened next was so fast that Harrison dropped his wine glass. Caleb did not throw a punch, raise his voice, or show a single ounce of anger. He possessed the quiet, immovable strength of a man who spent his life wrestling heavy machinery and livestock. Caleb simply reached up, clamped his hand over Spencer's wrist, and twisted his arm downward with a smooth, effortless motion that forced the arrogant man to bend at an awkward angle. Spencer let out a sharp gasp of pain and dropped the pen. Caleb stood up smoothly, maintaining his unyielding grip, and pressed his other hand firmly between Spencer's shoulder blades. With a single, decisive push, Caleb pinned Spencer face down against the mahogany table. Spencer struggled wildly, kicking his expensive shoes and trying to twist out of the hold, but he was completely trapped. Caleb held him there, with the casual ease of leaning against a fence post. He looked down at Spencer, his voice remaining low and steady, and advised him never to lay a hand on him again. Brittany shrieked and jumped out of her chair, demanding Caleb let her husband go. Harrison stood up, his face pale as he realized their intimidation tactic had failed spectacularly. My mother set her wine glass down, eyes darting nervously toward the locked door. I did not move to intervene. I watched the men of my family realize that their fabricated corporate power meant nothing against genuine physical reality. Caleb did not hurt Spencer. He merely held him securely against the wood, rendering him powerless while maintaining absolute silence. I ignored the chaos. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my digital tablet. I tapped the screen, my eyes focused on the scrolling lines of incoming data. I waited for Harrison to stop demanding Caleb release his son-in-law. Once the room quieted to the sound of Spencer breathing heavily against the table, I slid my tablet across the wood until it rested in front of my father. I told Harrison that while they were busy locking doors, I had been working on my own corporate strategy. I explained I knew Spencer was desperate for capital to keep his remaining construction sites operational. He had over-leveraged his holding company and relied entirely on a single regional supplier for his raw materials. I pointed to the glowing screen. The document displayed a formal confirmation of a hostile corporate takeover. Over the past 48 hours, my financial team had quietly purchased a controlling majority stake in that exact supply chain conglomerate. I leaned forward, looking directly into my father's horrified eyes. I informed him I now owned exclusive rights to every piece of material Spencer needed to finish his commercial developments. As of 5 minutes ago, I had officially frozen all active accounts and halted every scheduled delivery to Spencer's job sites. He had no money, and now he had no materials. His construction projects were effectively dead, and his investors would begin pulling out by tomorrow morning. Harrison stared at the tablet as if it were venomous. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the documents proving my total acquisition of their supply chain, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. Brittany stared at her father, waiting for him to fix the situation, but Harrison simply sank back into his chair. Spencer stopped struggling, his body going limp against the table, as the reality of his financial ruin washed over him. He realized trying to extort me had cost him everything. The silence in the soundproof room was absolute. I reached across the table, retrieved my tablet, and placed it back into my bag. I told my father that his little extortion contract was entirely worthless, and I suggested he tell his restaurant manager to unlock the doors before I called the authorities and reported them for false imprisonment. My mother had remained silent during this exchange. She sat frozen in her chair, staring at the empty space where the tablet had been. Vivian's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure panic. The composed woman vanished entirely. She slammed both hands down on the table, knocking over a crystal water glass. The water spilled, soaking the edges of Harrison's contract. She looked at me with wild, manic eyes. Her chest heaved as she let out a desperate, shrill scream that echoed off the mahogany walls. She shrieked that I could not do this to them, that I had no right to destroy the family legacy. Then, in a moment of pure, blinding desperation, Vivian leaned across the table and screamed that I had not actually won. She shrieked that my grandfather's final will contained a hidden sealed clause that nobody knew about. Her voice cracked as she hysterically declared that the hidden clause legally granted Harrison full unrestricted mineral rights to the exact acres of original farmland Caleb currently owned. The sheer absurdity of my mother's screaming claim hung in the stifling air of the private dining room. Caleb did not flinch, but I felt the sudden rigid tension shoot through his arm where my hand rested. Harrison looked up at Vivian with a mix of shock and furious reprimand. She had just revealed his absolute trump card in a moment of pure emotional hysteria. The restaurant manager, clearly terrified by the escalating hostility and my threat of police intervention, scrambled to unlock the heavy mahogany doors. The deadbolt clicked, and the doors swung open, letting in the soft jazz and ambient noise of the main dining area. Caleb and I walked out without another word, leaving my family to suffocate in the wreckage of their own failed ambush. The long drive back to our country estate was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. Caleb gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bone white. That farmland was not just property to him. It was a century of his family's blood, sweat, and heritage. The idea that my father could snatch it away using an archaic legal trick made my stomach turn into tight, painful knots. I tossed and turned, and I barely slept that night, my mind racing through complex corporate statutes and property laws, endlessly waiting for the morning sun to finally rise. I kept visualizing the physical map of the valley, desperately trying to understand exactly how Harrison could possibly circumvent our clearly established modern property rights. The moment the clock struck 8 the next morning, I was standing on the concrete steps of the county clerk's office. Gregory was right beside me, clutching a thick leather briefcase. The air was crisp, holding the bitter chill of early winter, but I felt completely numb to the freezing cold. We bypassed the regular civilian lines and went straight to the property archives deep in the basement of the municipal building. The room smelled strongly of old paper floor wax and decades of stagnant air. We absolutely needed to verify Vivian's wild claim before Harrison could file any formal injunctions against Caleb's property. Gregory approached the tall wooden counter and specifically requested the original plat maps and deed transfers dating back to my grandfather's era. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses perched on the very end of her nose, retreated into the long rows of towering metal filing cabinets. She rummaged through the vast collection of local county history for what felt like an absolute eternity, while I nervously tapped my shoe against the faded linoleum floor, praying my mother was simply lying to scare me. When she finally returned, she dropped a massive dust-covered ledger onto the counter. Gregory carefully opened the fragile pages, tracing his index finger along the faded black ink of the original property lines. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read over his shoulder. Vivian was not lying. There was a hidden, highly obscure clause buried deep within a land grant that predated my grandfather's primary will. It was an archaic property line loophole that essentially retained the subsurface mineral rights of the entire valley for the original estate holder, regardless of who currently owned the surface acreage. Because Caleb's great-grandfather had purchased that specific parcel of land from my grandfather's holding company over 70 years ago, the legal mineral rights had technically never transferred. Harrison was attempting to weaponize a forgotten piece of paper to violently claim ownership of the dirt directly beneath Caleb's beautiful home. The conflict had instantly shifted from a sterile game of corporate sabotage to a vicious, deeply personal attack on my husband's sacred heritage. The horrible realization that they would target his family history just to punish my success sickened me to my very core. I pulled out my phone and immediately called my executive team at Verdant Solutions. I strictly ordered them to drop everything they were currently doing. I instructed my chief financial officer and lead researchers to quickly mobilize our firm's vast resources and dig into every single land registry tax record and historical survey associated with that specific valley. I critically needed to know if that archaic clause was still legally binding or if it had been successfully nullified by subsequent zoning laws. We were rapidly racing against the clock to find a legal precedent that would block Harrison's sneaky maneuver before he could officially deploy it. Gregory began taking rapid photographs of the heavy ledger pages with his smartphone, quietly muttering obscure legal statutes under his breath. He confidently assured me we could quickly file a protective motion to stall any immediate legal action Harrison might attempt to take. We just needed to firmly prove that the mineral rights had been officially abandoned due to multiple decades of absolute non-use. I felt a massive surge of pure adrenaline. I was totally ready to fiercely fight my father in every single courtroom in the state to permanently protect Caleb's legacy. Every single resource I commanded would be aggressively utilized to defend the man who had always defended me. I quickly paced the dusty floor, my mind intensely calculating our aggressive legal counterattack. I turned back to the counter to directly ask the clerk for the subsequent transfer records from the late 1990s. The woman was typing very slowly on her computer terminal, her brow heavily furrowed in deep confusion. She clicked her computer mouse a few times, leaning much closer to the glowing screen. She carefully adjusted her glasses and looked up at Gregory with a deeply apologetic expression. She quietly told us that we could not file a protective motion against Harrison. Gregory completely stopped photographing the ledger and loudly demanded to know why. The clerk turned her monitor toward us so we could clearly see the digital database. She revealed a devastating update that made the blood instantly freeze in my veins. Harrison did not just discover the legal loophole, he had already acted on it. The screen showed that Harrison had legally severed the mineral rights from the historical estate and transferred the contested deed entirely. He had not done it this morning. He had done it yesterday afternoon, right before he sat down at the restaurant to aggressively demand my revenue. He had transferred the valuable rights to a shadowy, untraceable offshore shell company based out of the Cayman Islands. Caleb's ancestral farm was no longer just threatened by my arrogant father. It was an immediate legitimate legal jeopardy, completely controlled by a faceless entity operating entirely outside of local jurisdiction. The cold fluorescent lights of the clerk's office hummed above us as the reality of my father's calculated strike set in. Gregory stared at the computer monitor, his jaw tight with professional outrage, while I felt a profound, chilling clarity wash over me. Harrison had not just crossed a boundary. He had declared absolute war on the very foundation of my husband's life. We politely thanked the stunned clerk, gathered our legal notes, and quickly walked back out into the freezing morning air. The drive back to Verdant Solutions was silent. My mind was no longer blindly racing with useless panic. Instead, it was moving with absolute lethal precision. As soon as I walked through the glass doors of our corporate headquarters, I bypassed my corner office and marched directly down the hall to our technology and cybersecurity division. I found Marcus, our chief technology officer, standing by the main server array. I handed him the printed details of the Cayman Islands shell company and told him I needed every digital footprint associated with that specific entity uncovered immediately. I explicitly gave him my full authorization to use whatever extensive resources were necessary to tear down the walls of their offshore fortress. Marcus and his team went to work with ruthless efficiency. For the next 8 hours, the cybersecurity division traced IP addresses, unraveled hidden holding companies, and followed a complex labyrinth of international wire transfers. I sat at a long conference table in their department, drinking black coffee and watching the massive digital monitors display the interconnected web of my father's finances. By late afternoon, Marcus called me over to his primary workstation. He pointed to a series of heavily encrypted banking ledgers his team had managed to expose. The initial funding used to establish the offshore shell company and process the aggressive mineral rights transfer had not come from my father's personal wealth. It had not come from Spencer's failing real estate firm either. The money had been funneled through a series of dummy accounts to mask its true origin. Marcus hit a key and the screen displayed the original source of the capital. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the names attached to the initial wire transfers. The breath hitched in my throat. I recognized almost every single name on the list. They were the most prominent members of the Oakmont Country Club, the exclusive society my parents had belonged to for over 3 decades. Men and women who had dined at our house, attended my childhood birthday parties, and trusted my father explicitly. As Marcus cross-referenced the incoming deposits with the outgoing transfers, the devastating truth materialized right in front of me. Harrison was not merely moving money around to hide it from creditors. He had been actively embezzling millions of dollars from his own wealthy friends to fund his aggressive legal attacks and prop up Spencer's failing business ventures. The luxurious lifestyle my parents flaunted, the designer clothes, the expensive cars, the arrogant posturing, it was all built on a massive web of deceit. My family's vast wealth was nothing more than a desperate, collapsing Ponzi scheme. They had been draining the retirement funds and investment portfolios of their closest peers for years, using new money to pay off old debts, while skimming enough off the top to maintain their wealthy facade. The sheer unprecedented scale of the massive fraud was entirely sickening. Harrison had weaponized his social status to steal from people who considered him a brother. I knew I could not sit on this information. If I simply handed the files over to the authorities, the ensuing federal investigation could take months to freeze the accounts, giving Harrison ample time to liquidate whatever was left and vanish. I needed to cut off his social and financial lifeline at the absolute source. I asked Marcus to compile a secure encrypted drive containing the most damning financial ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and the names of the defrauded country club members. Once the drive was in my hand, I grabbed my coat and drove straight to the financial district. My target was Richard Hughes, the long-standing president of the Oakmont Country Club Board of Directors. Richard was a retired federal judge and a man known for his ruthless integrity. I requested an emergency, strictly confidential meeting through his private secretary, citing a matter of urgent financial security regarding the club's members. 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from Richard in his sprawling wood-paneled office overlooking the city. He offered a polite but confused smile as I sat down. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed the encrypted drive onto his desk and handed him a printed summary of our cybersecurity team's findings. I watched his face closely as he put on his reading glasses and began to scan the first page. The polite smile evaporated instantly. The color slowly drained from Richard's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He read through the names of his friends, colleagues, and fellow board members, tracing the massive sums of money that Harrison had systematically siphoned out of their supposedly secure investment pools. His hands began to tremble slightly as the full magnitude of my father's betrayal became clear. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. He asked me how long this had been happening, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. I told him the digital trail went back at least 5 years. My father had been bleeding them dry while smiling to their faces at every Sunday brunch and charity golf tournament. Richard took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, leaning back heavily in his leather chair. The retired judge took a long, shaky breath and looked out the window at the darkening city skyline. He finally turned his complete attention back to me and revealed a devastating update of his own. He stated that the timing of my discovery could not possibly be worse. He leaned across his desk, his expression grim and urgent. Richard told me that Harrison was currently organizing the annual Oakmont Foundation Charity Gala. He was scheduled to host the massive, highly publicized event this very weekend at his own private estate. The entire purpose of the gala was to secure a new round of heavy financial commitments from the club's wealthiest patrons. Harrison was actively using the guise of philanthropy to solicit millions of dollars in fresh investments to cover his tracks and replace the missing capital before the club's mandatory annual auditors arrived next week. The sheer audacity of Harrison using a charity gala to rob his closest friends one final time hung in the heavy air between Richard and me. I stared at the retired federal judge, watching the deep disgust settle firmly into the weathered lines of his face. He assured me he would quietly gather the rest of the board members and prepare them for the inevitable fallout, but he urged me to proceed with extreme caution. Harrison was a wounded animal backed into a dark corner, and those were always the absolute most dangerous predators to confront. I thanked Richard for his valuable time, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked out of the towering financial building. The biting winter wind whipped fiercely through the downtown streets, but my mind was completely focused on the impending weekend. I pulled out my cell phone and immediately called Caleb. He answered on the first ring, his deep voice a grounding anchor amidst the swirling chaos of my family's deceit. I told him absolutely everything. I explained the offshore shell company, the embezzled country club funds, and the fake charity gala Harrison was orchestrating to cover his tracks. Caleb was entirely silent for a very long moment. When he finally spoke, his steady voice carried a quiet, terrifying resolve. He told me that simply fighting Harrison in a sterile courtroom was no longer an acceptable option for our family. My father had actively chosen to maliciously threaten our home, our land, and our peaceful future together. He was shamelessly using the very community that trusted him to directly fund his aggressive illegal attacks against us. Caleb stated that we needed to dismantle him entirely, permanently, tearing down the fabricated social empire he hid behind. We needed to expose him in front of every single person he was actively trying to steal from today. I agreed with him immediately. A quiet legal defense would only give Harrison enough time to slip away and hide behind expensive corporate lawyers. We were going to crash the charity gala, and we were going to bring his entire world crashing down. I drove straight back to the Verdant Solutions corporate headquarters. The massive business machine I had meticulously built over the past decade was about to be unleashed with devastating force. I bypassed my executive assistants and went directly into the corner office of my extremely capable chief financial officer. I ordered him to pull the comprehensive financial records of the Oakmont Country Club itself. If Harrison was scamming the club members, I critically needed to know exactly where the club stood financially right now. Within an hour, my financial team successfully uncovered a highly vulnerable pressure point. The prestigious country club was carrying a massive multi-million-dollar commercial loan from a recent luxury property expansion. They had been quietly attempting to restructure their staggering operational debt for the past 6 months without any success. I did not hesitate for a single second. I instructed my financial team to aggressively utilize Apex Holdings, our primary corporate acquisition firm, to immediately approach the private lender holding the country club's commercial paper. We offered to buy the entire outstanding debt portfolio at a premium, demanding an expedited transfer of the financial rights. The commercial lender, eager for an instant and highly profitable cash out, agreed to the strict terms without asking any difficult questions. By Friday afternoon, the massive financial transaction was officially complete. Apex Holdings now legally possessed the exclusive rights to the Oakmont Country Club's entire operational debt. I effectively held the absolute financial leash on Harrison's entire elite social circle. If the board of directors tried to quietly protect my father to save their own reputations, I could instantly call in the massive loan. I could easily bankrupt the very institution that defined their wealthy status. I had successfully built an impenetrable wall around my father, ensuring he had absolutely nowhere to run this time. Saturday evening finally arrived with a heavy electric tension. The quiet air inside our farmhouse felt incredibly thick as Caleb and I silently prepared for the upcoming gala. This was no longer just about protecting a piece of farmland or defending a corporate merger from a hostile takeover. This was a final, definitive battle for our fundamental right to exist completely outside of my family's toxic control. I stood in front of our bedroom mirror, carefully adjusting the sleek, floor-length black gown I had chosen to wear. It was remarkably simple, very elegant, and completely devoid of the flashy ostentation my mother always favored at social events. I pinned my dark hair back in a severe tight twist. I was not dressing for a party tonight. I was methodically putting on my armor for war. Caleb walked slowly into the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He looked impossibly handsome, yet his stoic expression was completely unreadable. The rugged, calloused hands that spent countless hours working the soil were now buttoning the cuffs of a crisp white shirt. He walked up close behind me, placing his large hands very gently on my bare shoulders. We looked at our reflection in the large mirror together. He kissed the top of my head and softly promised me that by the time the sun came up tomorrow, my father would never be able to hurt us again. I leaned back against his solid chest, drawing immense emotional strength from his quiet, unwavering confidence. We were walking straight into the lion's den, but I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. My family had spent my entire existence deliberately making me feel small, insignificant, and utterly unworthy of their prestigious legacy. Tonight I was going to show them exactly what true power looked like. I reached over to the dresser to grab my clutch. Next to it, my smartphone suddenly buzzed, vibrating against the polished wood. The screen illuminated the room, displaying a new text message. The familiar name at the top of the screen made my jaw clench tightly. It was simply Brittany. I picked up the cell phone, swiping to read the incoming message. She could not resist the urge to gloat, completely oblivious to the trap snapping shut around her husband and father. The text was dripping with her signature arrogance and spite. I stared at the glowing words, a cold smile slowly spreading across my face as I read her message out loud. We verified the deed. You are losing the farm tomorrow morning. Wear something nice when you pack your bags, peasant. I slowly lowered the phone, letting the screen fade to black. Caleb let out a low chuckle that vibrated through the floorboards. He took the device and tossed it onto the velvet armchair. He told me Brittany's arrogance was going to be the exact thing that blinded her to the reality of tonight. He gently offered his arm, and I took it, feeling the steady warmth of his skin through his fine suit. We walked down the staircase of our farmhouse and stepped into the biting winter air. A black, chauffeured Maybach was already idling quietly in the circular driveway, its sleek frame gleaming brightly under the soft glow of our front porch lights. I arranged the private car earlier that afternoon. If my family wanted to measure a person's worth by their outward display of wealth, I was perfectly willing to speak their shallow language for one evening. The driver respectfully opened the heavy door for us. We slid into the leather interior, and the vehicle quietly pulled away from our property. The journey to my parents' estate took an hour, but the silence inside the car was comfortable. I watched the rural landscape shift into the sprawling, manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs. Harrison's heavily mortgaged property sat at the end of an exclusive gated community. The iron gates were propped wide open tonight, welcoming a steady stream of luxury vehicles. A long, winding driveway led up to the imposing brick mansion, currently illuminated by dozens of harsh theatrical spotlights. Valets in red vests were running back and forth, opening doors for the elite who had gathered to unwittingly fund my father's desperate financial cover-up. Our Maybach smoothly joined the line of arriving cars, gliding past the decorative fountains positioned near the grand entrance. When our vehicle stopped beneath the portico, the head valet rushed forward to open my door. I stepped out onto the red carpet, the cold wind catching the heavy silk of my designer gown. The dress was a masterclass in understated elegance, a midnight blue creation that draped perfectly over my frame, without relying on the cheap, flashy embellishments my mother always preferred. Caleb emerged from the opposite side of the car, and the sheer visual impact of his presence caused several nearby conversations to instantly halt. He wore a custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that highlighted the broad, powerful build he had earned from years of physical labor. He carried himself with a quiet, dominant authority that instantly commanded respect. He buttoned his jacket with casual ease and walked around the vehicle to stand firmly by my side. We did not look like the dirty farmhands my family constantly portrayed us to be. We looked like old money royalty, projecting a level of grounded sophistication that made the surrounding crowd look entirely artificial. Caleb offered me his arm once again, and we walked up the wide marble steps toward the mansion. The noise inside the grand foyer was deafening. A string quartet was playing in the corner, desperately trying to be heard over the loud, overlapping conversations of the hundreds of wealthy guests. Waiters carrying silver trays of expensive champagne wove through the densely packed room. As Caleb and I stepped across the threshold, a sudden palpable shift rippled through the crowd nearest to the entrance. People turned to look at us, their eyes darting over Caleb's imposing figure and my elegant gown. Whispers quickly spread from group to group as the local socialites tried to identify the striking couple who had just arrived. Some recognized me from my childhood, their faces registering deep confusion as they tried to reconcile the successful woman standing before them with the banished daughter my mother had described for years. The sea of expensive suits and sequined dresses instinctively parted, creating a clear path for us as we walked deeper into the extravagant ballroom. I scanned the crowded room, my eyes sweeping past the lavish ice sculptures and the towering champagne pyramids. I finally found Vivian holding court near the massive stone fireplace. She was wearing a heavily beaded, ostentatious gold dress that caught the harsh light with every single movement. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by the mayor's wife, a crystal champagne flute held delicately in her right hand. Brittany and Spencer were standing right beside her, eagerly soaking up the undivided attention of the local elite. I gently touched Caleb's arm deliberately, guiding him directly toward my family's toxic circle of influence. As we slowly closed the distance, the wealthy crowd around Vivian began to turn and stare directly at us. The sudden oppressive silence radiating from her audience finally caused my mother to look up. Vivian's eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, she simply did not recognize me. Then the realization hit her with the physical force of a freight train. She saw the expensive cut of my gown, the undeniable confidence in my posture, and the imposing tailored strength of the husband she had constantly ridiculed. Her toxic, carefully constructed narrative that I was a pathetic, dirty farm girl instantly shattered in front of her most important friends. The color drained from Vivian's face, leaving her looking completely hollow. Her jaw dropped open in pure, unadulterated shock. Her fingers went limp, and the crystal champagne glass slipped from her hand. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending glass shards and expensive alcohol flying across the floor. Brittany gasped, taking a stumbling step backward as she recognized Caleb. The loud sound of the shattering glass echoed through the suddenly quiet room, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Across the vast ballroom, Harrison was shaking hands with a wealthy real estate developer. He heard the commotion and turned his head, his professional smile still plastered on his face. When he spotted Caleb and me standing confidently in the center of his gala, the fake smile vanished. His face instantly turned a dark, blotchy shade of red. Pure, unrestrained fury radiated from his posture as he realized his absolute worst nightmare had just walked through the front doors of his desperate cover-up event. He aggressively shoved his way through the crowd, abandoning his wealthy investor. He raised his hand and wildly signaled to his private security team stationed near the exits. Harrison marched directly toward us, his voice booming over the string quartet as he loudly declared that I was socially unfit to attend such a prestigious gathering, desperately ordering his heavy guards to forcefully eject us from his property immediately. The heavy footfalls of 4 massive security guards echoed across the polished marble floor as they rapidly closed the distance between the exit doors and our position. They were dressed in sharp black suits with discreet earpieces, their expressions hardened into masks of pure professional intimidation. Harrison trailed just steps behind them, his face still flushed with explosive anger as he continued to loudly demand our immediate removal. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The sudden suffocating silence in the vast ballroom amplified my father's frantic shouting. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, screaming that I was trespassing on private property and had absolutely no right to ruin his philanthropic evening. Hundreds of wealthy guests watched the unfolding spectacle with wide, horrified eyes. Caleb did not even flinch as the largest guard approached us. He simply shifted his weight firmly, planting his boots against the marble floor, and positioned his broad shoulders slightly in front of me. He possessed the quiet, terrifying stillness of a man fully prepared to dismantle anyone who dared to lay a single hand on his wife. I gently squeezed Caleb's forearms silently, letting him know that physical force would not be necessary tonight. I maintained my absolute composure, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high. I waited patiently until the head of the security detail was mere inches away from me. He reached his large hand out to forcefully grab my arm. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, I opened my sleek evening clutch. I withdrew a single, crisply folded sheet of heavy legal paper and held it up directly in front of the guard's face. He paused, his thick brow furrowing in deep confusion, as his eyes darted from the document to my calm expression. I spoke in a low, crystal-clear voice that carried effortlessly through the quiet room. I calmly informed him that he was currently looking at a verified proof of ownership transfer. I explained that as of yesterday afternoon, my corporate entity, Apex Holdings, had legally acquired the entire outstanding commercial debt of the Oakmont Country Club. The head security guard stood frozen, his hands still awkwardly suspended in midair. I continued speaking with absolute icy authority. I explained that because the country club was technically funding the operational budget for this lavish charity gala, including the massive invoice for the private security firm he worked for, I was now effectively the primary holder of his employment contract. I politely suggested that he carefully read the executive signature at the very bottom of the page before he made the catastrophic career mistake of physically assaulting his new employer. The large man slowly took the document from my hand. His eyes scanned the dense legal text, widening noticeably as he reached the unmistakable corporate seal and my authorized signature at the conclusion of the page. He swallowed hard, the sharp realization dawning on him that my claims were completely legitimate. He immediately lowered his hand and took a very deliberate step backward. He tapped his earpiece quietly, issuing a strict command to his 3 subordinates. The other guards instantly halted their aggressive approach, dropping their hands and stepping away from us. Harrison stopped dead in his tracks, staring at his expensive security team in absolute bewilderment. He loudly demanded to know what they were doing, screaming at them to follow his explicit orders and drag us out into the street. The head of security turned to my father with a deeply apologetic but firm expression. He respectfully informed Harrison that his firm could not legally comply with the request to violently eject the chief executive officer of their parent contracting company. The collective gasp that rippled through the wealthy crowd was incredibly satisfying. Harrison stood completely paralyzed in the center of the ballroom, utterly humiliated in front of the exact people he was actively trying to manipulate. His mouth opened and closed silently, his brain entirely unable to process the staggering reality that his ultimate display of social power had just been completely neutralized by a single piece of paper. I calmly retrieved my legal document from the stunned guard, folded it with precise movements, and slipped it back into my clutch. Vivian was still frozen near the fireplace, staring at me as if I were a terrifying apparition. Brittany gripped her husband's arm, her face twisting into an ugly mask of seething hatred as she realized her arrogant text message had been ridiculously premature. Caleb offered me a warm, genuine smile that reached his bright blue eyes. He smoothly offered me his arm once again, and we seamlessly turned away from my floundering family. We gracefully stepped into the surrounding crowd of wealthy socialites, moving with the comfortable ease of people who truly belonged exactly where they stood. The guests instinctively parted for us, their previous disdain completely replaced by burning curiosity and newfound respect. We approached the tall, silver-haired real estate developer Harrison had abandoned moments earlier. The man was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, watching us with intense, calculating interest. I politely introduced myself and Caleb, offering a warm, professional handshake. The developer returned the greeting, his eyes darting nervously toward my father, who was still standing frozen. I took a slow sip of water from a passing waiter's tray and casually complimented the lavish decorations. Then, leaning in slightly, I quietly mentioned how unfortunate it was that the Oakmont Country Club was carrying such an unsustainable level of toxic commercial debt. Caleb smoothly chimed in, noting the tragic reality of over-leveraged assets in the current economic climate, especially regarding certain failing local construction firms. We did not make direct accusations. We merely dropped highly calibrated lethal hints about massive financial instability and desperate restructuring tactics. We gracefully moved from group to group, methodically planting deep seeds of toxic doubt among my father's most crucial investors. We casually discussed the sudden surge of offshore shell companies and the rising dangers of unregulated investment pools. With every polite conversation, the atmosphere of the grand gala began to rapidly curdle. The previously joyous celebratory mood morphed into a heavy, nervous anxiety. People began whispering urgently to their spouses, checking their smartphones, and casting highly suspicious glances toward Harrison. From across the vast room, Spencer watched the sudden devastating shift in the wealthy crowd's energy. Absolute panic consumed him. He desperately rushed the stage and grabbed the microphone, attempting to forcefully fast-track his desperate, fraudulent investment pitch and blindly collect the checks before I could completely destroy their massive, elaborate con tonight. Spencer's knuckles were stark white as he gripped the heavy metal microphone stand. The harsh theatrical stage lights illuminated the thick rolling beads of sweat gathering rapidly on his forehead and upper lip. He looked entirely frantic, a desperate man watching the solid floorboards give way beneath his expensive leather shoes. He forced a wide, completely unnatural smile and began speaking at a rapid, breathless pace. He loudly welcomed the confused guests, attempting to smoothly pivot the elegant charity gala into a high-pressure corporate sales pitch. The wealthy audience murmured in polite bewilderment as he suddenly unveiled a massive high-definition projection screen directly behind him. The glowing digital display illuminated a pristine, sprawling landscape that I recognized instantly. It was Caleb's ancestral farm. The rich, dark soil, the towering ancient oak trees, and the winding freshwater creek were plastered across the massive screen, overlaid with aggressive flashing neon graphics, detailing projected profit margins and commercial zoning permits that did not actually exist anywhere in reality. Spencer raised his voice, his tone taking on the slick, desperate cadence of a late-night television infomercial. He passionately described this quiet land as an unprecedented, highly lucrative agricultural development project. He falsely claimed his holding firm had recently acquired the exclusive development rights to the massive acreage and was currently offering a strictly limited window for elite ground floor investments. He waved his free hand, dramatically urging the wealthy country club members to pull out their checkbooks and secure their financial futures before the end of the evening. I did not wait for him to finish his fabricated, deceitful presentation. I let go of the real estate developer's hand and began walking deliberately toward the raised wooden stage. The grand ballroom was completely packed with people, but the crowd instinctively parted for me, creating a wide, entirely silent path through the center of the room. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my shoulders pulled back, and my eyes locked directly on my sweating brother-in-law. I could physically feel the intense burning stares of hundreds of prominent guests tracking my every single movement. The heavy dark silk of my designer gown brushed softly against the polished marble floor as I glided forward with absolute purpose. Up on the stage, Spencer finally noticed my steady, unwavering approach. His loud voice caught sharply in his throat. He stumbled heavily over a complex financial term, his confident, rehearsed pitch immediately fracturing into a pathetic string of nervous stammers. He tried to speak louder desperately, trying to command the fracturing attention of the room, but the audience was no longer watching his flashy presentation. They were completely captivated by the banished daughter, calmly ascending the carpeted steps of the main stage. I reached the wooden podium and stopped right beside him. Spencer physically recoiled from me, his eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated panic. He clutched his microphone like a protective shield, but he was entirely speechless, unable to form a single coherent word. I reached out with a steady, confident hand and pulled the secondary microphone from its metal holder on the side of the podium. A short, sharp burst of harsh audio feedback pierced the silent room, causing several guests in the front row to visibly flinch. I waited patiently for the ringing metallic echo to completely fade away before I lifted the cold microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom speakers, calm, incredibly steady, and utterly ruthless. I looked directly at Spencer and asked him to please clarify the exact projected return on investment he was actively promising for a piece of property he did not legally possess. The silence that instantly crashed down upon the vast glittering room was absolutely deafening. It was not a polite, expectant quiet from a captivated audience. It was the heavy, suffocating, entirely lethal silence of a room full of highly intelligent, powerful people simultaneously realizing they were being actively conned by a man they trusted. I did not break eye contact with Spencer for a single second. He opened his mouth to speak to defend himself, but only a dry, pathetic wheeze emerged from his throat. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost trapped under the bright, unforgiving stage lights. Down in the audience, the retired federal judge I had spoken with earlier in the day let out a loud, knowing scoff that carried clearly through the room. That single sound completely broke the tension. A low, dangerous murmur began to ripple through the wealthy crowd as the country club members turned to one another, their expressions shifting rapidly from mild confusion to deep, aggressive suspicion. They were looking up at the projected financial graphics with narrowed, calculating eyes, suddenly seeing the desperate, transparent frauds staring right back at them. From the corner of my eye, I saw sudden, chaotic movement near the massive stone fireplace. Vivian had finally snapped out of her paralyzed, horrified shock. The absolute public destruction of her carefully maintained social facade had pushed her into pure, unhinged panic. She saw me holding the microphone, firmly commanding the room with the devastating truth she had tried so very hard to bury for years. She completely abandoned all pretense of wealthy elegance and grace. She hiked up the skirt of her heavy beaded gold dress and began sprinting awkwardly across the polished marble floor. She was not running toward the stage to confront me directly. She was desperately scrambling toward the exposed audio control booth, situated on a slightly raised platform at the far side of the ballroom. She intended to manually pull the heavy power cords from the main soundboard, foolishly hoping to physically cut the electricity and silence my voice before I could explicitly expose the rest of their massive interconnected financial crimes to the entire room. She shoved aggressively past a startled waiter, sending a tray of glasses crashing to the floor. She reached the bottom of the short metal staircase leading to the audio equipment, panting heavily. Before her foot could touch the first step, a tall figure smoothly blocked her path. Caleb stepped seamlessly into the narrow aisle, completely cutting off her route. Vivian slammed to a halt, her chest heaving as she glared up at my husband with undisguised venom. She opened her mouth to scream, demanding he move. Caleb did not blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He held the glowing screen up, calmly explaining he was live streaming Spencer's fraudulent pitch directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Vivian's face went completely slack. The sheer terror of federal involvement paralyzed her. She slowly backed away from the massive audio control board, her trembling hands raised in silent surrender. Caleb did not move an inch, his phone steadily recording every panicked movement in the room. With the sound system secure, I turned my full attention back to the man sweating profusely beside me at the podium. Spencer looked like he was about to physically pass out. He stared at the microphone in my hand, his chest heaving heavily under his expensive tailored suit. I did not raise my voice, but the crystal-clear audio equipment carried my cold tone to every single corner of the silent ballroom. I politely asked Spencer to step aside. He practically tripped over his own feet as he scrambled away from the center of the stage, seeking immediate refuge near the heavy velvet curtains. I pulled a small, sleek flash drive from my leather clutch. The highly specialized technology division at Verdant Solutions had ensured the drive was programmed to automatically override standard presentation software. I calmly plugged it directly into the wooden podium's primary USB port. The massive high-definition screen directly behind me flickered momentarily. The fake neon-colored profit projections and the stolen images of Caleb's farm instantly vanished into the dark. A collective gasp echoed loudly through the stunned crowd as a new stark white document appeared on the sprawling display. It was a high-resolution side-by-side forensic analysis of the fraudulent property deed transfer. On the left side was the falsified signature they had submitted to the county clerk. On the right side was an authentic, legally verified copy of my actual signature. The glaring visual discrepancies were highlighted in bright, undeniable crimson circles. I looked out at the vast sea of wealthy investors. I calmly explained that the lucrative agricultural development they were just eagerly pitched did not legally belong to my father's holding firm. I told them the beautiful land belonged to my husband, and the only reason Spencer held any documentation tonight was because he had actively forged my signature to unlawfully transfer the deed. I let the sheer weight of the heavy word forgery settle deeply over the silent room. I watched prominent bankers, real estate magnates, and country club board members lean forward, their eyes scanning the massive forensic evidence displayed behind me. The undeniable proof of a federal crime was being projected in 50-foot high definition. I was not finished. I tapped a single key on the podium's sleek laptop. The screen smoothly shifted to a simple black audio playback graphic. I leaned into the microphone and directly informed the captive audience that a forgery of this massive scale required careful, deliberate coordination. I told them I wanted them to clearly hear exactly how my family operated behind closed doors. I pressed play. The pristine acoustics of the ballroom instantly broadcasted the secret recording I had captured weeks ago. Brittany's shrill, unmistakable voice entirely filled the room. The audio was crystal clear. Every single person in the crowd heard my sister openly mocking me. They heard her explicitly admit, without a single shred of hesitation, that her husband Spencer had independently initiated the entire wire fraud scheme. They listened quietly as Brittany proudly detailed how they had deliberately falsified the corporate documents to steal millions from Verdant Solutions and violently rip the farmhouse away from Caleb and me. The recording ended, leaving a toxic, ringing silence in its immediate wake. Then the entire ballroom violently erupted into absolute chaos. The polite, wealthy veneer of the high society charity gala instantly evaporated. The elite investors realized they were not at a philanthropic event. They were the prime targets of a massive, aggressively collapsing criminal conspiracy. Angry, indignant shouts rose rapidly from the crowd. Men in expensive tuxedos began furiously pulling out their cell phones, urgently dialing their personal bankers and wealth managers. I could hear them barking frantic orders to immediately cancel the large checks they had written earlier in the evening. They were loudly instructing their financial teams to freeze any pending wire transfers to my father's dummy accounts. Women in designer gowns were backing far away from Vivian and Brittany, casting looks of absolute disgust and deep betrayal at my mother and sister. The social isolation was immediate and entirely brutal. My family was becoming fundamentally radioactive right in front of my eyes. The country club president, Richard Hughes, stood near the front row holding up a thick manila folder. He began loudly informing the other board members about the embezzled retirement funds, verifying that the very same people who forged the deed had been actively stealing their private investments. The outrage reached a dangerous fever pitch. Spencer was cowering near the stage curtains, his face buried deeply in his hands as former colleagues shouted aggressive legal threats at him. Brittany was sobbing hysterically, frantically tugging at the arms of her former socialite friends. But they physically recoiled from her grasp, turning their backs on her completely. The grand, glittering empire my parents had spent 30 years building through lies, daily manipulation, and stolen capital was burning to the ground in a matter of minutes. Every stolen dollar, every fake friendship, and every single ounce of stolen prestige was rapidly turning to ash. I stood calmly at the wooden podium, completely untouched by the screaming and the furious movement happening below me. I simply watched the beautiful, chaotic destruction of my abusers unfold exactly as Caleb and I had meticulously planned. I slowly looked down at the polished marble floor directly in front of the elevated stage. Harrison had somehow pushed his heavily perspiring body through the angry, shouting mob of defrauded investors. He looked entirely broken. His expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo was rumpled. His gray hair was wildly disheveled, and his face was a sickly, ashen color. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch who had cruelly dictated my entire existence was permanently gone. His vast corporate empire was aggressively collapsing around him in real time, the terrifying sound of canceled checks and ruined social reputations constantly ringing in his aging ears. He violently stumbled forward, his knees hitting the hard stone floor right at the very edge of the stage. He looked up at me, his eyes extremely wide with a desperate, pathetic terror. Harrison completely dropped his heavy head, his wrinkled hands visibly trembling as he desperately begged me to immediately stop the public presentation, loudly pleading for me to please show mercy to my own flesh and blood. I looked down at the man kneeling in his ruined tuxedo. This was the towering, terrifying figure who had dictated every single aspect of my childhood, the man who had demanded absolute perfection and ruthlessly punished any sign of independence. Now he was reduced to a trembling, hollow shell, weeping openly on the polished marble floor. His perfectly styled silver hair was matted with sweat, and his expensive silk bow tie hung completely askew against his damp collar. He reached one shaking hand up toward the edge of the wooden stage, his fingers blindly grasping at the dark fabric of my designer gown. I did not step back. I did not flinch or offer a comforting smile. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, and stared down into the terrified eyes of the man who had spent 30 years making me feel completely worthless. The grand ballroom around us was still buzzing with the chaotic, frantic energy of panicked investors canceling checks and shouting into their cell phones. But a tight circle of heavy silence had formed directly around the stage. The wealthiest, most influential people in the city paused their frantic damage control to watch the mighty Harrison beg for his survival. I let his desperate pleas for mercy hang in the stale, heavy air. I wanted him to feel the absolute suffocating weight of this moment. I wanted him to experience the exact same helpless, paralyzing terror he had so casually inflicted upon me for my entire life. He sobbed loudly, repeating the phrase about flesh and blood over and over again, as if those words held some kind of magical protective power. I slowly lowered the silver microphone slightly, ensuring my voice would still carry clearly through the massive speakers without overpowering the sudden strained quiet of the immediate crowd. I looked at his grasping, desperate hand, and then looked directly into his tear-filled eyes. I asked him with a perfectly calm, icy precision which version of me he was currently speaking to. The question confused him. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing, as he tried to process my words through his blinding panic. I took a single, deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage. The dark silk of my gown slipped smoothly from his trembling fingers. I did not raise my voice, but the intense, unyielding authority in my tone made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I asked him if he was asking for mercy as the daughter he threw out into a freezing, blinding blizzard because her hard-working husband smelled like cattle. I watched the memory hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders slumped, his chest caving inward, as the brutal reality of his past cruelty was dragged out into the harsh stage lights. The surrounding guests gasped loudly, their expressions twisting into genuine revulsion as they heard the exact details of how he had treated his own child. But I was not finished. I gripped the sides of the wooden podium and delivered the final devastating blow. I asked him if perhaps he was instead asking for mercy as the chief executive officer of the holding company that just legally foreclosed on this very estate an hour ago. The words struck him with lethal force. Harrison let out a raw, guttural sound, something between a strangled gasp and a dying wheeze. He slumped completely forward, his forehead pressing against the cold marble floor, as the staggering, impossible reality finally crushed him. The sprawling country club, his massive corporate headquarters, his luxury vehicles, and the very ground he was kneeling on no longer belonged to him. He had absolutely nothing left. Not a single dollar, not a shred of social standing, and not a roof over his head. The devastation was absolute and entirely complete. The revelation of the foreclosure was the final undeniable signal for the remaining guests. The elite investors, the powerful judges, and the wealthy socialites had seen and heard more than enough. Disgust radiated from the crowd in palpable rolling waves. They turned their backs on my weeping father in complete unison. A massive, unified wave of people began aggressively flooding out the grand double doors of the ballroom. They did not stop to offer condolences or say their goodbyes. They simply abandoned the toxic, collapsing family they had once eagerly followed. They rushed out into the cool night air, eager to distance themselves from the spectacular, fiery ruin of my parents' social empire. Vivian was still trapped near the audio booth, surrounded by angry board members demanding answers about their stolen retirement funds. She let out a piercing, hysterical wail as she watched the most powerful people in the city walk out on her forever. Brittany was curled into a pathetic ball near a toppled cocktail table, clutching her ruined designer dress and sobbing uncontrollably. Through the sheer, magnificent chaos of the mass exodus, my eyes instinctively tracked movement near the heavy velvet curtains at the far side of the stage. Spencer had stopped sweating and had transitioned into pure survival mode. He realized that my father begging on the floor and the crowd rushing the main doors had created a massive, chaotic distraction. He slowly, carefully peeled his back off the wall and began slinking silently toward the shadowed service exit. He kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, desperately trying to blend into the dark shadows of the stage rigging. He thought he was going to simply slip away into the night, abandon his weeping wife, and run from the massive federal crimes he had brazenly orchestrated. He thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He was completely wrong. He quietly pushed the heavy metal door open and slipped into the long, carpeted service corridor. He broke into a frantic, heavy sprint, his leather shoes slapping loudly against the floorboards as he raced toward the main lobby. He desperately checked over his shoulder, ensuring no one was actively following him through the quiet halls. He rounded the final corner, a desperate smile of relief just beginning to form on his pale face. He pushed through the swinging lobby doors, expecting to find the empty valet station. Instead, he found 4 stern men in dark windbreakers. Federal agents, alerted directly by Caleb's immediate contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission, were already waiting patiently in the center of the brightly lit lobby. The lead agent stepped forward smoothly, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. His escape was over. It ends. I looked down at the man kneeling in his ruined tuxedo. This was the towering, terrifying figure who had dictated every single aspect of my childhood, the man who had demanded absolute perfection and ruthlessly punished any sign of independence. Now he was reduced to a trembling hollow shell weeping openly on the polished marble floor. His perfectly styled silver hair was matted with sweat, and his expensive silk bow tie hung completely askew against his damp collar. He reached one shaking hand up toward the edge of the wooden stage, his fingers blindly grasping at the dark fabric of my designer gown. I did not step back. I did not flinch or offer a comforting smile. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, and stared down into the terrified eyes of the man who had spent 30 years making me feel completely worthless. The grand ballroom around us was still buzzing with the chaotic, frantic energy of panicked investors canceling checks and shouting into their cell phones, but a tight circle of heavy silence had formed directly around the stage. The wealthiest, most influential people in the city paused their frantic damage control to watch the mighty Harrison beg for his survival. I let his desperate pleas for mercy hang in the stale, heavy air. I wanted him to feel the absolute suffocating weight of this moment. I wanted him to experience the exact same helpless, paralyzing terror he had so casually inflicted upon me for my entire life. He sobbed loudly, repeating the phrase about flesh and blood over and over again, as if those words held some kind of magical protective power. I slowly lowered the silver microphone slightly, ensuring my voice would still carry clearly through the massive speakers without overpowering the sudden strained quiet of the immediate crowd. I looked at his grasping, desperate hand, and then looked directly into his tear-filled eyes. I asked him with a perfectly calm, icy precision which version of me he was currently speaking to. The question confused him. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process my words through his blinding panic. I took a single, deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage. The dark silk of my gown slipped smoothly from his trembling fingers. I did not raise my voice, but the intense, unyielding authority in my tone made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I asked him if he was asking for mercy, as the daughter he threw out into a freezing, blinding blizzard because her hard-working husband smelled like cattle. I watched the memory hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders slumped, his chest caving inward, as the brutal reality of his past cruelty was dragged out into the harsh stage lights. The surrounding guests gasped loudly, their expressions twisting into genuine revulsion as they heard the exact details of how he had treated his own child. But I was not finished. I gripped the sides of the wooden podium and delivered the final devastating blow. I asked him if perhaps he was instead asking for mercy as the chief executive officer of the holding company that just legally foreclosed on this very estate an hour ago. The words struck him with lethal force. Harrison let out a raw, guttural sound, something between a strangled gasp and a dying wheeze. He slumped completely forward, his forehead pressing against the cold marble floor as the staggering, impossible reality finally crushed him. The sprawling country club, his massive corporate headquarters, his luxury vehicles, and the very ground he was kneeling on no longer belonged to him. He had absolutely nothing left. Not a single dollar, not a shred of social standing, and not a roof over his head. The devastation was absolute and entirely complete. The revelation of the foreclosure was the final undeniable signal for the remaining guests. The elite investors, the powerful judges, and the wealthy socialites had seen and heard more than enough. Disgust radiated from the crowd in palpable rolling waves. They turned their backs on my weeping father in complete unison. A massive unified wave of people began aggressively flooding out the grand double doors of the ballroom. They did not stop to offer condolences or say their goodbyes. They simply abandoned the toxic, collapsing family they had once eagerly followed. They rushed out into the cool night air, eager to distance themselves from the spectacular, fiery ruin of my parents' social empire. Vivian was still trapped near the audio booth, surrounded by angry board members demanding answers about their stolen retirement funds. She let out a piercing, hysterical wail as she watched the most powerful people in the city walk out on her forever. Brittany was curled into a pathetic ball near a toppled cocktail table, clutching her ruined designer dress and sobbing uncontrollably. Through the sheer magnificent chaos of the mass exodus, my eyes instinctively tracked movement near the heavy velvet curtains at the far side of the stage. Spencer had stopped sweating and had transitioned into pure survival mode. He realized that my father begging on the floor and the crowd rushing the main doors had created a massive chaotic distraction. He slowly, carefully peeled his back off the wall and began slinking silently toward the shadowed service exit. He kept his head down, his shoulders hunched desperately, trying to blend into the dark shadows of the stage rigging. He thought he was going to simply slip away into the night, abandon his weeping wife, and run from the massive federal crimes he had brazenly orchestrated. He thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He was completely wrong. He quietly pushed the heavy metal door open and slipped into the long carpeted service corridor. He broke into a frantic heavy sprint, his leather shoes slapping loudly against the floorboards as he raced toward the main lobby. He desperately checked over his shoulder, ensuring no one was actively following him through the quiet halls. He rounded the final corner, a desperate smile of relief just beginning to form on his pale face. He pushed through the swinging lobby doors, expecting to find the empty valet station. Instead, he found 4 stern men in dark windbreakers. Federal agents, alerted directly by Caleb's immediate contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission, were already waiting patiently in the center of the brightly lit lobby. The lead agent stepped forward smoothly, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. His escape was over. It ends. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut with a sharp, echoing snap that completely shattered Spencer's last remaining delusion of control. The lead federal agent spun him around with practiced efficiency, firmly pressing his shoulder against the cool glass of the lobby doors, while quickly conducting a thorough search of his tailored pockets. The agent began reciting his Miranda rights in a loud, entirely professional voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. Spencer's knees buckled underneath him, his expensive leather shoes scrambling uselessly against the polished floor as he desperately tried to find his footing. He began to whimper openly, a pathetic, high-pitched sound that echoed off the high ceiling of the empty lobby. He babbled frantically, wildly, promising the stern agents that he would gladly cooperate, that he could give them everything they needed to completely dismantle Harrison's entire holding company if they would just let him make a single phone call. The agents did not entertain his desperate bargaining for a single second. They gripped him firmly by his upper arms and forcefully marched him out of the shadows, dragging him directly back into the blinding light of the grand ballroom. The doors swung open violently, announcing their dramatic return to the scattered remnants of the high society crowd. The angry murmurs of the betrayed investors instantly ceased as they turned to witness the golden son-in-law being paraded through the room like a common criminal. Brittany had been kneeling on the floor, desperately trying to salvage her torn reputation with anyone who would still listen. When she saw her husband being roughly guided through the crowd in heavy metal restraints, a guttural shriek tore from her throat. The horrifying reality of her impending future finally crushed her carefully manicured delusions. Her lavish lifestyle, her unlimited credit cards, and her unearned social superiority were entirely gone. She scrambled to her feet, her face completely flushed with pure, venomous rage. Instead of running to comfort her sobbing husband, she turned violently toward her parents. The fragile, highly manufactured loyalty of our family shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of the horrified audience. Brittany pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at Harrison's chest and began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She aggressively declared that her parents had completely ruined her life. She wildly claimed she knew absolutely nothing about the fraudulent wire transfers or the stolen property deeds. She loudly insisted that her father had forced Spencer into the illegal scheme, aggressively painting herself as a completely innocent, ignorant victim of their overwhelming greed. Vivian heard the treacherous, damning accusations pouring from her favorite daughter's mouth and completely lost her mind. The sophisticated, deeply entrenched socialite mask she had worn for 3 decades instantly melted away, leaving behind an incredibly ugly, desperate monster. Vivian lunged forward with her hands raised, her expensive jewelry clinking loudly as she physically attacked Brittany. She shrieked for her daughter to shut her mouth, aggressively trying to slap Brittany across the face to stop the steady stream of public confessions. Brittany ducked away from the swinging hand, violently shoving her mother backward into a heavy wooden cocktail table. The table tipped over with a loud crash, sending shattered crystal and spilled champagne sprawling across the floor. Harrison desperately tried to push himself off the ground to intervene frantically, reaching out to pull his wife and daughter apart, but he was entirely too weak and physically exhausted. The three of them collapsed into a screaming, chaotic tangle of expensive fabric and pure, unfiltered hatred. They tore at each other like trapped wild animals, loudly broadcasting their deepest, most toxic resentments to the remaining guests. The incredibly wealthy, influential people who had once kissed their rings now watched the pathetic, violent spectacle with wide eyes and absolute disgust. The perfect, image-obsessed family was publicly devouring itself in real time. I stood completely motionless at the edge of the elevated stage, watching the humiliating destruction unfold below me with absolute cold detachment. There was no pity left in my heart, no lingering sense of familial duty, and absolutely no regret. I had spent my entire existence begging for a tiny scrap of validation from these terrible people. I had endured decades of cruel manipulation, constant emotional abuse, and relentless psychological warfare. Seeing them physically tear each other apart in front of the entire city was not just incredibly satisfying, it was the ultimate necessary closure. Caleb stepped up beside me, his broad shoulders practically touching mine. He wrapped his warm, calloused hand firmly around my waist, grounding me securely in the chaotic moment. He watched my screaming family with the same cold, unyielding detachment, his jaw set in a hard, protective line. We did not flinch as Brittany hurled another vicious insult at Vivian, nor did we blink when Harrison covered his ears and began weeping into his hands again. We simply stood together as a united, unbreakable front, silently bearing witness to the spectacular consequences of their own malicious greed. The massive double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open again, completely interrupting the violent spectacle happening on the floor. A familiar, commanding figure stepped directly into the bright light of the room. It was the exact same local police officer who had aggressively harassed Caleb at the front gate just weeks prior. He marched through the room with heavy, confident strides. He completely ignored the federal agents currently holding a weeping Spencer in tight restraints. He walked straight past the horrified socialites and the angry investors, his eyes locked entirely on the violent struggle occurring near the toppled table. He reached the chaotic scene and forcefully stepped right between my flailing mother and my screaming sister. He reached out and tightly grabbed Vivian by her wrists, forcefully pulling her hands away from Brittany. He did not hesitate for a single second. He loudly and clearly announced to the entire silent room that Vivian was under immediate arrest for her direct role in the notary fraud scheme. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her delicate, heavily jeweled wrists. Vivian gasped loudly, staring down at the cold metal in absolute horror. She desperately tried to pull away, crying out that she was a prominent socialite, not a common criminal. The stern officer completely ignored her frantic, pathetic pleas. He forcefully turned her around and loudly began reading her rights. Her devastating fate was completely sealed forever. The golden child and the matriarch were facing the absolute justice they had evaded for their lives. The following Monday arrived with a crisp clarity that matched the surgical precision of our final strike. The chaotic drama of the charity gala had been replaced by the cold reality of federal indictments and aggressive asset seizure. Caleb and I sat quietly in the glass-walled conference room of Verdant Solutions, flanked by a small army of ruthless litigators. Across the mahogany table, Harrison and Vivian looked like hollow ghosts. Without Spencer to shield them in fraudulent legal jargon, they were completely exposed to the devastation of their own choices. The legal proceeding was not a negotiation. It was a highly satisfying, methodical dismantling of their stolen empire. My lead attorney slid thick stacks of forensic evidence across the table, legally forcing my parents to immediately liquidate their personal assets to cover the massive damages caused by the forgery scheme. Every hidden bank account, offshore investment, and piece of fine art purchased with stolen funds was systematically seized. I watched with absolute detachment as Harrison's shaking hand signed away the final remnants of his wealth. The actual eviction took place precisely 3 hours later. Caleb and I stood on the pristine lawn of the sprawling mansion my parents had terrorized me in for decades. A team of court-appointed auditors watched closely as Harrison and Vivian were forced to pack their bags, ensuring they left the estate with only what they legally owned, which amounted to a few basic changes of clothing. Vivian wept loudly, clutching a battered canvas suitcase as she stood on the front steps, staring in disbelief at the heavy foreclosure signs being hammered into her immaculate lawn. Harrison moved sluggishly, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. He paused at the bottom of the stone staircase and turned toward me. His hands trembled violently as he reached into his wrinkled jacket pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of the two of us from my childhood, taken before I had learned to hide my spirit from his constant cruelty. He held the photo out to me, his eyes silently pleading, making one final attempt to weaponize my guilt. I stepped forward and calmly took the photograph from his trembling fingers. I looked down at the image of the sad, terrified little girl I used to be. Then, without a single flicker of hesitation, I turned and walked over to the massive industrial shredder the legal team had brought to securely dispose of the voided foreclosure documents. I held the photograph over the spinning metal blades, looked my father right in his tear-filled eyes, and let it go. The shredder roared loudly, instantly turning the manipulative memory into a pile of meaningless white dust. I turned my back on Harrison and Vivian for the very last time, leaving them standing alone in the driveway as the authorities officially locked the heavy iron gates of the mansion behind them. 3 perfectly quiet, profoundly beautiful months passed. The suffocating, toxic legacy of my parents was permanently gone, paved over by actual, undeniable growth. Caleb and I stood side by side on the crest of a rolling green hill, the warm afternoon sun beating down on our shoulders as we surveyed our newly expanded farm. Our legal protections were now entirely bulletproof. The sprawling acreage of the former elite country club no longer belonged to corrupt board members or greedy investors. We had legally acquired the foreclosed land and transformed the manicured, useless golf courses into a massive, thriving community garden and a sustainable agricultural training center for local youth. Where wealthy, arrogant men had once plotted corporate takeovers, rows of vibrant crops now grew straight and tall. Teenagers from the surrounding communities were currently laughing and working together in the lower fields, learning how to cultivate the soil and build something genuine with their own hands. We had not just survived the vicious toxicity of my family. We had sterilized it, replacing their legacy of manipulation with genuine community value. Caleb wrapped his strong arm around my shoulders and pulled me close, pressing a soft kiss against the top of my head. I leaned back against his warm chest, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath of the sweet earth-scented air. As we turned to walk back toward our restored farmhouse, I noticed Caleb holding a small stack of mail he had collected from the end of the driveway. Nestled between seed catalogs and farming invoices was a stark white envelope. My eyes locked onto the blue stamp in the upper right corner, indicating it had been mailed directly from a state penitentiary. The return address printed in the corner was unmistakable. It belonged to Vivian. I took the envelope from Caleb's hand and walked slowly up the wooden steps to our wraparound porch. I stood in the warm sunlight staring at the cramped handwriting of the woman who had brought me into the world and then spent 30 years trying to break me. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the single sheet of lined paper. The letter was exactly what I should have expected. There was absolutely no apology, no genuine reflection, and not a single ounce of personal growth. Vivian was pathetically begging for me to deposit commissary money into her prison account. She spent 3 paragraphs complaining bitterly about the terrible food and the awful smell of the penitentiary, demanding that I fulfill my basic duty as a loyal daughter and rescue her. It was just the same predictable systemic rot she had always peddled. I did not argue with the letter. I did not feel a sudden wave of protective anger, nor did I feel the familiar grip of childhood guilt. I felt nothing but a profound, settled calm. I walked over to the stone fire pit on the edge of the patio where a few warm embers were still crackling from the previous night. I dropped the lined paper into the center of the pit and watched the orange flames instantly consume the bitter words, turning my mother's final manipulation into a wisp of gray smoke. I pulled my phone from my pocket, permanently blocked the penitentiary's phone number, and set it down on the wooden table. I did not look back at the fire. I simply turned and walked out into the bright open fields, into the warmth of the beautiful, undeniable life Caleb and I had built together. The air was perfectly clear, the sky was endlessly blue, and my heart was finally truly free. The dust has finally settled on the glittering, shattered remains of my family's empire, leaving behind a profound and echoing silence. When you spend your entire life as the designated scapegoat in a deeply toxic, narcissistic family system, you are conditioned to believe that you are the problem. You are taught that your worth is strictly tied to your absolute submission, and that demanding basic respect is an act of unforgivable rebellion. But standing on that stage, watching the illusion of my parents' perfect legacy burn to the ground, I realized the most important truth of all: blood does not obligate you to endure a lifetime of abuse. Society constantly pushes the narrative that we must forgive our toxic relatives simply because we share DNA. We are told to keep the peace and turn a blind eye to the blatant favoritism that elevates a golden child while actively destroying the black sheep. My journey proves that you cannot heal a dynamic that relies entirely on your subjugation. My parents and my sister built their grand, luxurious lives on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and stolen capital. They believed their wealth and status made them untouchable, allowing them to forge signatures and steal futures without a single consequence. My victory did not come from matching their chaotic emotional cruelty. It came from cold, meticulous patience. When dealing with abusers who thrive on your emotional reactions, your greatest weapon is absolute detachment. By silently gathering undeniable forensic proof and securing my legal standing, I stripped them of their ability to gaslight me. I refused to let them twist the narrative. The forensic analysis and the secret audio recording were merely the tools of their destruction. My true power was my unyielding self-respect. I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to arrive and decided to deliver my own absolute justice. True wealth is never measured by country club memberships, stolen property deeds, or the fake smiles of high society galas. It is measured by the peace you feel when you walk into your own home, surrounded by people who genuinely love and respect you. Caleb and I did not just save our farm. We reclaimed our fundamental right to live authentically, completely free from the suffocating grip of systemic family abuse. The golden child fell. The untouchable patriarch wept, and the ruthless matriarch faced the cold reality of steel handcuffs. If you have ever been treated as the scapegoat, constantly underestimated or betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you, know that your ultimate success is the sweetest revenge. Take back your power, set unbreakable boundaries, and never apologize for protecting your peace. Hit the like button and subscribe to this channel to join our growing community of survivors and share your own journey of overcoming toxic family dynamics in the comment section below.